Shavua Tov, when my children were in nursery school, in kindergarten, they came home with a beautiful sentence that they say before reciting the daily Shema, the proclamation of faith. And the phrase that they would say is, right hand over your eyes and accept the yoke of heaven. Yad yamin ala einayim nikabel ol malchut shamayim. This is important because the recitation of the Shema, which is obligatory morning and evening, is accepting that God is the king. Now, what exactly is the meaning of Shema? It's a very powerful prayer. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. So the Sefer HaChinuch, a wonderful medieval work on the commandments, explains that because human beings are physical beings, we have certain drives and temptations, so we need to constantly have on a daily basis a reminder that we have the yoke of heaven upon us, that the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, and therefore we have to live our lives on a different level. I would like to add further explanation that can actually be a life changer on a daily basis. In these parshas, where we're reading about Joseph and the brothers and his father, there's a lot of crying. Joseph cries a few times in the last parsha whenever the brothers talk about him, or when he sees his brother Binyamin, he's crying. And of course, Yaakov is crying for 22 years because he thinks Joseph is dead. And he's saying, I will go down to my grave in mourning and sadness, and he's crying 22 years. There's a lot of crying. So then we come to that very emotional, powerful moment, dramatic moment, one of the most dramatic, beautiful moments in all of literature, when Jacob has heard that Joseph is alive, and he comes to Egypt to greet them, and the two are going to be reunited. And of course, when they come, each in their chariot or wagon, they run to each other, and Joseph is crying, no surprise there. And what is Yaakov doing according to the rabbis? Yaakov is reciting the Shema. Are you serious? Now, you couldn't wait 2 minutes, you have to say Shema right now, it's the end of the time. If you miss another minute, you're late. If that's the case, well, Joseph also needs to say it. So both of you can be abnormal. Excuse me, pardon me for saying. But I don't think that that's what they were actually doing. I don't think that Yaakov was reading the words of the Shema at that moment at all, because at that moment that would be just just weird. But rather, Yaakov was intentionally not crying. Why? Because he read the Shema, and he understood that the Shema tells you that under circumstances like this, you do not cry. What exactly are the circumstances that one should not cry under? Well, King Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes tells us that there is a time for tears and a time for laughter. Time for tears, time for laughter. What are those times? Let's look at King Solomon's father's book, the book of Psalms. It says there, Ba'erev yalin bechi v'laboker rina. In the evening, will lie tears, and in the morning, song, joy, happiness. So maybe the time to cry is at night, and the time to be happy is in the daytime. I don't think it means actually the time of the day. I think that it's teaching us a value, that a time like night is appropriate for tears, and a time like day is not appropriate. I believe that there are two different types of general crying. One is kosher, legitimate, and understandable, and one is bad. What is the one that's legitimate? When one cries about the past. One cries about tragedies that have happened in the past, it is appropriate. We have a whole day, Tisha B'Av, which is a day of crying for the destructions of the temples and other tragedies that happened in the history of the Jewish people. And it's appropriate to cry on those days. That's why it says, Ba'erev yalin bechi. In the evening, it is time for crying to lay down, that there is tears. Why? Because the evening is after the day. One cries about the tragedies and the problems that may have occurred on the previous day. But to cry about worries for the future, this is wrong. When the Israelites cried about the future, at the time when the spies came back from the land of Israel with a bad report, so that was considered a sin in and of itself. The people cried on that night. Yes, it was at night, but they were crying not about yesterday, but about tomorrow, because they were afraid that they were going to get killed if they tried to go into the land. So they cried about future worries, and God was very upset with them. He decreed they should die in the desert, wander there for 40 years, and that on that night, which was the calendar date of the 9th of Av, would be decreed a night of crying for generations. So crying about the future is wrong, because the morning time, la boker, the morning, is when the day starts. So then we're not focused on yesterday anymore. We're focused on today. We're focused on the future. And in the future, Rina. It has to be song. It has to be joy. Now, that's not to say that there aren't worrisome situations in the world. I'm sure that the Jews of Europe in August of 1939, because there was a brewing storm on the horizon that turned out to be more horrific and more nightmarish than anybody imagined, had good reason to cry about the future, to be very worried. But on the other hand, the Jews of Israel in May of 1967, they also saw a nightmarish future coming, as all of the Arab countries seemed to be preparing to destroy the state of Israel. And yet, less than a week later, the greatest salvation in our history came in the Six-Day War, and Jerusalem was reunited, and wonders happened. So the idea is that the future, we don't know. And even if there is a difficult time in the short term, the long term could be very different. So therefore, we do not cry about worries in the future. And Yaakov understood this is from Kriyat Shema, because in Shema it says, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The name for the Lord is Hashem, and that is in Hebrew the four-letter name of God, which implies Haya, Hoveh, V'yiyeh. God was, God is, and God shall be. In other words, that God is with us into the future, and therefore we have no reason to cry about the future. And Yaakov had reason to be concerned about his future, because after all, he knew that Abraham had been told by God that his descendants would be slaves and oppressed for 400 years in a foreign land. And Yaakov now understood that that foreign land was Egypt. So, and this slavery was going to be coming to his, if not his children, then maybe his grandchildren or great-grandchildren, but it was on the way. So he had plenty to be worried about. He had plenty of future worries to cry about. But Yaakov said, this is wrong, this is inappropriate. And how did he know that? Well, God is one. God is in the past, in the present, and the future. But he even saw it in his own life. He had just cried for 22 years. And during those 22 years that he was crying for his son Joseph, something happened, something didn't happen to him that should have happened to him. And that is, he had no prophecy. Excuse me. God did not speak to him during all of those 22 years. But as soon as his children told him, Joseph is alive, he's ruling Egypt, and when Yaakov finally believed them, the Torah says, Vatechi ruach Yaakov avihem. Jacob's spirit lived. And once that happened, then all of a sudden God comes and speaks to Jacob and says, do not fear going to Egypt. I will bring you down there. I will bring you back up, and Joseph shall put his hand upon your eyes. So Yaakov says, oh, crying is something that keeps God away. If I want God in my life, I cannot cry anymore, even if there are good reasons for the future. And to add to that, when he sees Joseph, he understands why. Because he thought Joseph was dead, and here he's alive. Not only is he alive, but Yaakov was concerned that maybe Joseph had lost his spirituality in Egypt. He was alone there for a long time. But no, when he sees him, he sees that Joseph is still the same Yosef HaTzadik, the same righteous Joseph that he was when he was still living in his father's house. And not only that, Abraham was told that the descendants are going to be slaves. Well, Joseph was a slave. He was a slave, not just a slave, but a slave and a prisoner with the lowest element of Egyptian society, and yet he survived physically and spiritually. And if you're going to ask me about the golden temptation, well, here he is, the vice pharaoh, I guess is the best title to use, and he is still alive physically and spiritually. So Yosef proves to Yaakov there's no use in crying about the future. God is great. We don't know what's going to be, but we have to have faith and we have to keep that smile. So Yaakov refuses to cry. But there's another explanation as well. I think there are two types of tears about the future. Crying about the future, we said, is bad, but not always. There is tears of complaint and tears of action. Tears of complaint is when a person folds their arms and says, I am helpless, I can't control it, I don't know what's going to be, and then they cry. That is a complaint. It is a person saying, I don't believe that God is there going to be with us, and that is bad. That's what the Jews did when the spies came back and told them that the land of Israel is going to be impossible. However, tears of action, those are the tears that go into a prayer. When a person prays with tears, that's something super powerful. It's a nuclear weapon of prayer, if you will. The rabbis say that when the temples were destroyed, the gates of prayer were locked, but the gates of tears never were locked. Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik explains that we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah because the shofar is the sound of tears, and it elevates the prayers which we recite to become prayers with tears which pierce those gates. And I think you can see that lehavdil, to distinguish between Torah and other wisdoms, in literature. The Wizard of Oz, right? Dorothy is wanting to go into the Holy of Holies, to Emerald City, and the guard won't let her in. So she sits down and starts to cry about how she'll never get home to see her family whom she loves. And her tears are so infectious that the guard, who is peeking out from this little window in the door, he starts to cry. And what does he do? He opens up the door and lets her into the Holy of Holies. That walk, that march through those hallways into the inner sanctum is very biblical in its overtones. I don't think that Frank L. Baum, who was not Jewish, necessarily was disconnected. I think he understood these biblical metaphors, and he seems to have known this Gemara, that the rabbis say that the gates of tears are still open. At least he intuitively knew it in his heart, if he didn't know it overtly. So that is the power of prayer with tears. Those are tears for the future that are legitimate. And so therefore one could say that there are two types of people who live their lives. There is an evening person, and I'm not talking about somebody who's running from bar to bar. An evening person is a person who, in the evening, we lie down, we are passive, we are still, almost not alive. A person who is an evening person, who when something is threatening, they become dead in bed, if you will. They fold their hands, they are helpless and hopeless, and they cry. Those are tears of complaint. That's a ba'erev yalin, the one who lies down in the evening, bechi, he will have tears. But laboker, but if somebody who has their tears in the morning, meaning part of their prayer, that they are preparing to face the day, and they start off by praying, God, please help us solve this problem in the world, whatever it might be, that's powerful. Then they're going to have, very quickly, rina, song and rejoicing. The prophet in the famous Haftarah, the second day of Rosh Hashanah, the prophetic reading, talks about Rachel, our mother, Rachel Imenu. A voice is heard in the highest heavens, Kol b'Ramah Shma. It is Rachel crying for her sons, for they have gone into the exile. So she is giving a prayer with tears, and it is piercing the heavens, it is reaching the highest levels, and it accomplishes its goal. How does it accomplish its goal? Because the prophet then says, Mini kolech mi bechi, stop your voice from crying. Yesh sachar le'peulatech, there is a reward for your action. What action had Rachel taken? She hadn't done anything. Oh yes, she did. She prayed with tears. Do it once, and then go to action. There is a reward for your action. V'shavu me'eretz oyev, your descendants will come back from the lands of their enemies. V'yesh tikva le'acharitech, there is hope for your end. Ne'um Hashem, saith the Lord, v'shavu le'banim ligvulam, the sons will come back to their land, to their borders, to their boundaries. So that is a Jew who is a AM Jew, somebody who gets up and maybe takes an action of tears, but it's prayer with tears, showing faith that I pray and I can change our fate. And then they spring into action. That's also in Kriyat Shema, because we say there, after the proclamation of faith, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. What do we say? V'ahavta, you shall love the Lord. V'shinantam levanecha, you shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall speak the words of Torah. You shall tie them around your arms and on your head. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house. In other words, if you have faith, the first thing you do is action. You love, you teach, you tie, you learn, you live. Take action. Don't be passive. Don't be a Jew in the evening. Be a Jew in the morning who says the prayers with tears and then goes out to fix the world, because that's the message, that's the purpose of the Jewish people, to believe in God and do the impossible. And so therefore Yaakov says, Joseph, you can cry about the past, about 22 years that we were missing. That's legitimate, that's kosher, that's human. You're allowed to be a human. But I have already cried those tears, and therefore if I cry no more, I am now going to smile. And I want to just end by saying that I saw this almost exact sort of a scene when I was on the March of the Living a number of years back. The March of the Living, on the Holocaust Day, you march from Auschwitz to Birkenau. These are the two concentration camps, the two main concentration camps in the town of Oswiecim. And it's about a 45-minute walk. And right next to me, with the group I was with, there was a young woman. She was a high school student. And she was walking with her grandfather. And her grandfather was a survivor of Auschwitz from the Holocaust. This was his camp. He was pointing out, I was here, we did that there, and so forth and so on. It was really quite something. And she is crying unbelievable the whole time, Niagara Falls. And he's got this huge smile, the Grand Canyon, if you will, broad smile. And so I asked a dumb question. I admit that it was dumb. How can you explain this, sir, that your granddaughter is crying so much, because they were right next to me, and you have this broad, broad smile? And he says, I'm smiling because I am here in Auschwitz with my granddaughter. In other words, he was saying, I am a Jew of the morning. I'm one who gets up out of the camps and rebuilds a beautiful life, and that is the way to change our destiny. There may be worries, there may be concerns on the horizon. We're entering a new lockdown, and there's elections. On the other hand, there's a vaccine coming along, and there's peace treaties with Arab countries. So we don't know what's going to be. But the one thing we do know is that if, instead of folding our hands and saying, I'm going to cry about the worries, which is destructive, instead we get up in the morning, we put those tears into prayer, but then take action, live our lives, do our impossibles, believe in God and do our impossibles. That's how we will change the world, and that's how we can change our own lives every day for the better. Shavuot Tov.